Are we live? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on CCUS today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to what we have to say, and perhaps you'll have questions towards the end, which we are happy to take. Since India, declared a net zero target by 2070, industrial decarbonization has been picking up pace. Although the pace has been gradual, it's been there for sure. Early, areas of interest as far as decarbonization is concerned has been on accelerated energy efficiency measures. In more recent times, it's been about how do we replace grid power with or captive power with renewable energy, renewable power. However, that will not take us, to net zero. Perhaps 20-30%, depending on what sector we are looking at. So, for the residual emissions, we certainly need other levers, and CCUS becomes one of the important levers that we are looking at. However, it's a long-term measure. Although it's a long-term measure, we perhaps need to act from a technological advancement perspective, from commercials perspective, so that even in the long term, we are able to achieve the reductions that we are hoping to from CCUS. So our attempt in this publication that we are launching today has been to evaluate the techno-economics and try and understand whether CCUS is a viable pathway even in the longer term. And more importantly, what is it that needs to happen for CCUS to be a viable option? So that's what this session is all about. Post my address right now, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Deepak Yadav, who will make a presentation on the key findings from the report. Subsequently, we'll have a panel discussion, and we have four very interesting panelists today. And subsequently, if time allows for it, we'll take a few questions from online participants, and then we'll close after that. Before I hand it over to my colleague, we would like to thank the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation for making this research possible. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Deepak.
Yeah, so you want to speak? Or I want to present. Thank you, Hemant. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Deepak Yadav, a senior program lead at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And today I'll be giving a briefing presentation on how can CCUS decarbonize India's industrial sector. We at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water impact sustainable development at scale with data, integrated analysis and strategic outreach. We are a not-for-profit policy research institution based out of New Delhi. As you can see on the slide, we broadly work on across three verticals. The first is on transformation, and we work on transformation because as a developing country, we cannot we cannot move ahead and become a developed country without solving the legacy problems that is facing our economy. And therefore, under transformation, we work on how can states achieve net zero emissions, how can we as a country achieve net zero emissions, how can we sort of accelerate the deployment of renewable energy technologies in the country through energy transitions? How can we solve for legacy issues in the power sector? How can we decarbonize the so-called hard-to-abate sectors of the economy? How can we generate sustainable livelihood in our country, right? The second aspect or the second vertical that we work on is the quality of life. And here we are trying to solve for the big issues like, how can we clean the air especially in the Indo-Gangetic plain of the country? How can we provide access to sustainable water, sustainable food, cooling, and mobility to our general populace? And to support the first two verticals, we have a third vertical, which is enabler, which basically looks at sustainable financing, sustainable technologies, circularity, climate resilience, international cooperation. We are currently a team of around 340 plus researchers, and we have four special initiatives. Those are CW Center for Green Energy Finance, a Green Finance Center, and Powering Livelihoods as well. Now, about 1.5 to 2 years ago, we released two reports. Those were on development of marginal abatement cost curves for the steel and the cement industry. What we see on the left-hand side of the slide deck is the emissions intensity, and this is for the steel industry in India. So we estimated that the average emissions intensity for steel in India is around 2.36 tons of CO2 per ton of crude steel. And then there are various decarbonization levers which can be used to mitigate emissions from the steel sector. So there's energy efficiency, which can reduce the emissions intensity by around 9%. There's a switch from captive power or grid electricity to renewable energy, which can further mitigate emissions by around 19%. Then the use of green hydrogen, the use of biomass, the use of natural gas can further reduce emissions by 6%, right? So using these three levers, we can reduce the emissions in the steel sector by around 30 to 35%. But the residual emissions can only be mitigated through the use of CCUS pathway. And if we assume a carbon capture rate of around 80 to 85%, around 56% of the total emissions in India's steel industry can only be mitigated through CCUS pathway. The story is somewhat similar for the cement industry as well. So, in our research, we estimated that the cement industry in India has an average emissions intensity of 0.66 tons of CO2 per ton of cement. And with the use of various decarbonization levers, be it energy efficiency, be it, alternative fuels or renewable energy, reduction of clinker factor, for example, about 30 to 35% of the total emissions can be reduced. But if we want to achieve net zero emissions, and again, CCUS is a must. In fact, coincidentally, we sort of estimate that about 56% of the total emissions in India's steel and cement industry can only be mitigated through the use of CCUS pathway. Therefore, the key takeaway from this slide is that CCUS is an imperative for India's steel and cement industry to achieve net zero emissions. And what do we do with the carbon which is captured from the stack of the cement and steel plants? It can be sequestered. So a report that was released by us about 2 years ago estimates a theoretical CO2 sequestration potential of about 650 gigatons. The realistic potential is somewhere between 100 to 300 gigatons. India's annual GHG emissions are around 3 gigatons. We have about 30 to 100 years worth of storage. So this is one aspect where CO2 can be stored, and CO2 can be stored in oil and gas fields, in saline aquifers, in basalts, etc. Another option for utilization of CO2 could be, we can use it for enhanced oil recovery, basically, storing or sequestering CO2 and also recovering some amount of oil. And there are other commercial applications which are already in place. CO2, for example, is used in beverages. It is used in food production as well. When we talk about utilization of CO2, broadly, there are three verticals where CO2 can be used. CO2 can be used for production of fuels, and here I'm talking about fuels like ethanol, sustainable aviation fuel, synthetic natural gas, or it can be used for production of chemicals like olefin production, urea production, production of acetic acid, isobutanol, formaldehyde, etc. The third application is the use of CO2 for production of carbonate minerals, and these are stable carbonate minerals through the mineral carbonation route. CO2 can also be used for production of other industrial commodities like soda ash, for example, right? The scope of this work and this presentation and also the report that we are launching today focuses on the utilization of CO2 for production of fuels and chemicals. So mineral carbonation is an upcoming research that will be released later on. But today we'll focus on the production of fuels and chemicals using CO2. And because we're talking of production of fuels and chemicals, in addition to CO2, we also need a green hydrogen as a feedstock. So essentially today we are discussing about green hydrogen based CCU applications for India. There are two broader research objectives of this particular study. The first is to, of course, assess the techno-economic aspects related to CCU. The second is on how much amount of CCU can actually happen with these options that we consider. So the table here indicated on the left, it lists various value-added fuels and chemicals which can be produced through CCU pathway, starting from olefins, sustainable aviation fuel to various chemicals like formaldehyde. And for techno-economic calculations, we do consider two scenarios. The first is a base case scenario where we sort of consider the pre-pandemic the so-called stable prices of these fuels and chemicals. And we also consider an aggressive scenario where we basically look at the post-pandemic prices and we pick the highest price that was witnessed over these past 5 years, right? So that is as far as techno-economic evaluation is concerned. Secondly, what we also do is, because we want to evaluate how much amount of CO2 can be utilized through these CCU pathways and how much amount of green hydrogen is needed, we look at the consumption of these chemicals and fuels in India. So for example, we on a national basis, we consume around 11.8 million tons of olefins, and for producing this 11.8 million tons of olefins through the CCU pathway, how much amount of CO2 is needed, what is the total amount of green hydrogen that is needed. So that is the kind of computation that we are doing to look at CCU from a policy perspective as well. And when we're talking about carbon capture and utilization, this graph here on the right hand side of the screen, it shows the total amount of CO2 that can be utilized in India across various CCU applications, ranging from the production of synthetic natural gas, olefins, sustainable aviation fuel, and including some miscellaneous applications as well. In totality, we estimate that the CCU applications that have been considered for evaluation here, we can utilize around 229 million tons of CO2. And just to give a context, India's national GHG emissions are around 3,000 million tons. So, out of 3,000 million tons, roughly 229 million tons is what can be utilized for production of fuels and chemicals. And how much green hydrogen do we need for utilizing these 229 million tons of CO2? We estimate the graph at the bottom on the right hand side basically shows the total amount of hydrogen which can be utilized across various CCU applications, and we estimate that around 34 million tons of green hydrogen is needed if we want to utilize 229 million tons of CO2 for CCU applications, right? And I think most of you who must be working in the green hydrogen space might be aware that the National Green Hydrogen Mission sets a target of producing around 5 million tons of green hydrogen. So 34 million tons is a significant number as far as our national green hydrogen production targets are concerned, right? But the key takeaway is that we can utilize around 229 million tons of CO2, and we need about 34 million tons of green hydrogen to utilize the said amount of CO2. What about the techno-economics of various CCU applications? This graph here, it on the y-axis, it shows the levelized cost of production of these fuels and chemicals, and on the x-axis we indicate the various chemicals and fuels which can be produced using the CCU pathway. There are three scenarios that we consider. So the scenario S1, it basically corresponds to the current scenario where we consider the green hydrogen cost of around $4.2 a kg. I understand recently the discovered price of green hydrogen was around $4.67 a kg, but we consider $4.2 a kg price of green hydrogen. We consider a CO2 cost of around $45 per ton of CO2. Those are typical industrial values today. We consider scenario 2, which is basically a future scenario where we consider the lowest possible cost of green hydrogen, and the 111 target on green hydrogen is a very famous target, and consequently we consider a green hydrogen price of around $1 a kg. CO2 price, we consider around $23 per ton of CO2. It can be sub 20 as well. And the third scenario, which is basically indicated in blue, is represents the cost of a fossil based product, right? And here there are a few observations that are noteworthy. First is, across all applications, none application is commercially viable today in scenario S1. In fact, if you look at a few applications, let's look at sustainable aviation fuel, for example. The current cost of production is around 2x at which aviation fuel is consumed today, right? But the good thing is, in the future scenario, which is S2, most applications become commercially viable. So let's say if green hydrogen hits $1 a kg, sustainable aviation fuel actually becomes commercially viable, and the production cost is in fact lower than the cost of the incumbent fuel. Other applications, DME, ethanol, methanol, and urea production also become commercially viable. The only exemption is the cost of production of olefins and synthetic natural gas, which are still significantly higher compared to their fossil counterparts. That's the first key takeaway. Second key takeaway is we have given a split of the production cost across various components, and those are more categorized broadly into three parts. The first is the cost of the process equipment itself, which is indicated in gray. Second is the light green, which is indicated in light green, is the cost of CO2 captured, and the third, the dark green cost, is the cost of green hydrogen. A key takeaway is the cost of carbon capture does not significantly impact the cost of production of these value-added fuels and chemicals. Therefore, if these fuels and chemicals have to become commercially viable, then the key message that we are driving is the cost of green hydrogen has to reduce to around $1 a kg. And what about the investments which are required, to sort of, utilize 229 million tons of CO2? The investment costs are indicated here on the primary y-axis, which is in billions of dollars. And then we have also indicated various fuels and chemicals which can be produced using CCU pathway. I'll not get into details of each application, but broadly, we estimate that to utilize 229 million tons of CO2, we will need 34 million tons of green hydrogen. That, given the current cost of green hydrogen and carbon capture, will need an investment of around $1.3 trillion. And in the best case, when the cost of green hydrogen reduces to about $1 a kg, even in that case, we are looking at an investment of around $500 billion, right? So that's a huge investment that we are looking for if we want to utilize 229 million tons of CO2 through green hydrogen-based CCU pathways. A question that is very often discussed in the policy circles is, what should we be doing? Is it cheaper to utilize CO2 for producing fuels and chemicals, or is it cheaper to just capture CO2 and store it, in underground reserves, right? And that is a question that we also wanted to answer. So this is indicated or illustrated here on the graph on the left hand side, where we indicate the abatement cost in dollars per ton of CO2 for two scenarios. There's a current scenario, which is the S1 scenario that was discussed earlier, and there's a future scenario as well. If we focus on the current scenario, we see that CCS has a ballpark cost of around $90. It could range from $70 per ton of CO2, could go all the way till $120 per ton of CO2. Depends on multiple factors, but a ballpark correct value could be around $90 per ton of CO2. This is the CO2 mitigation cost. If you look at CCU applications, the mitigation cost could range from $273 per ton of CO2 for sustainable aviation fuel uptake, and it could go up to $750 per ton of CO2 for synthetic natural gas, right? So that is a premium that we are looking at. And if you look at European market, the cost of CO2 was peak around $95 per ton of CO2, correct? So therefore, CCU pathways today are significantly more expensive than CCS. However, things change in the future, which is indicated here in future scenario, right? So CCS ballpark can come down to around $30 per ton of CO2. This is one of the best possible case. So $30 per ton of CO2. But in case of sustainable aviation fuel, in a future scenario, the abatement cost is minus $27, which basically implies that it is better to go for CCU applications. Of course, synthetic natural gas remains at a significant premium, and the cost of CO2 abatement is around $150 per ton of CO2, right? So in terms of cost, if you look at cost dynamic itself, then CCS looks cheaper today comparatively. But in the future, it will depend on which CCU application are we talking about. Something like sustainable aviation fuel or dimethyl ether might actually become commercially viable. But there is also a non-quantitative aspect that we need to consider when we're talking about a choice between CCU and CCS. Basically, we also want to become energy self-dependent by 2047. Therefore, we don't want to be importing crude oil, which will be used for production of sustainable aviation fuel. That is where CCU becomes imperative. It's irrespective of whether it makes economic sense or not. But we also want to achieve net zero emissions, and CCU volumes are significantly lower. This is about 229 million tons. Therefore, CCS is also imperative if you are talking about achieving net zero emissions by 2070. We also wanted to, given the significant premium on various CCU products, we also wanted to understand how will it impact the cost of producing steel, how will it impact the cost of producing cement. And the graph on the left hand side, it indicates the cost of production of steel through the blast furnace route. These are pre-pandemic prices. Therefore, you will see that the cost of production of steel was around 29 rupees a kg. And we consider an average emissions intensity of around 2.47. Now, with the use of various mitigation measures, as you can see in the green curve here, the cost of as we go towards lower emission intensity values, there is not a significant increase in the cost of producing steel till an emissions intensity of around 1.8 tons of CO2 per ton of crude steel. Now, if we want to reduce emissions below this particular point, then we have to go for CCUS, which will have a significant impact on the cost of production of steel. So in the worst possible case, Today, which is indicated in this graph, in this curve here, the cost of steel will increase by around 300% if the CO2 which is produced from blast furnaces is utilized for production of synthetic natural gas. And in the best possible case, we see a premium of around 100%. This is with the scale of economy today, the status of economy today. However, if the cost of sustainable aviation fuel reduces significantly in scenario S2, which is indicated in the blue curve here, then we actually see that the cost of production of steel reduces by around 8% in future. And of course, if you're going for something like synthetic natural gas, there's a 50% premium that we have to pay on the steel cost as well. Another very important thing to note here, and this was also indicated in the previous slide, is that unlike CCU, CCS will always have a positive cost externality, which means if you accept enhanced oil recovery, if you are going for CCS, the cost of steel or cement will always increase. And we have a similar observation to make on cement industry as well. I'll not go too much into detailing, but if we go for CCU pathway today, then we see roughly 100 to 300% increase in the cost of cement, which is significant increase. However, in future, the cost of near zero emission cement, actually reduces by 11% in certain applications. And, in case of synthetic natural gas, there's a 50% premium that we have to pay even in future case. And again, CCS will have a positive cost externality here as well. This is the last slide that I am presenting, where we are talking about the policy recommendations based on the study that we have done. And most of these recommendations the government of India is already working on. We are cognizant of that. The first recommendation is to sort of learn from the National Green Hydrogen Mission. And since most of the CCU applications basically involve the use of green hydrogen, the applications that have been considered in the study, the next phase of the green hydrogen mission should focus on developing favorable policies to build a CCU ecosystem in the country. The second recommendation that we make is, CCS is also an imperative. It's not that CCU alone will get us to net zero, and therefore the focus should also be on, developing a CCS ecosystem in the country. Basically, having on-ground assessment on what is the realistic or the actual CO2 sequestration potential in the country, where can we sequester those CO2, etc. Right? So those are the larger questions that should be answered as a part of the development of the CCS ecosystem. The third is the key learning. The third is the key learning from the National Green Hydrogen Mission, where we started the work on green hydrogen, but aspects related to safety standards and regulations were sort of started coming in later on. And therefore, right from the beginning, the focus should be on these aspects related to standards and regulations for the CCUS value chain as well. The fourth is on indigenous technology development, be it olefin production or sustainable aviation fuel production or ethanol or methanol production. The technologies for these and also the manufacturing of these technologies along with piloting should happen within the country. And the fifth is something which the DST is taking care of. There was a recent announcement where we sort of recommend to develop a collaborative research network of academic institutes, government, the policy institutes, industry, regulators, etc., and start building that technology know-how sharing, etc. So these are the top 5 recommendations that we have from the study. And with this, I'd like to hand it over to Hemant again.
Great, thank you, Deepak. There's a lot to digest there. I'm sure people will want to dig a little bit deeper. But you can find all of the analyses in our publication. It's on our website live now. So for those who don't know where to look for it, you can go to cew.in and on the top bar, you can hit on publications and you'll find all the publications from the industrial sustainability team. You can find it on the industrial sustainability team link, as well as the link has now been posted on chat. So you can click on the link there as well. So with that, we'll move to our panel discussion. We can perhaps have the panelists on the screen now. While that is happening, let me just introduce our panelists for the day. First, we have Venugopal from Niti Aayog. Thanks, Venu, for making the time. Venugopal is a senior energy and climate modeling specialist at Niti Aayog. An experienced policy professional, Venu is currently leading the energy modeling work on industrial decarbonization, and we'll get to that in a bit. where he's working on exploring ways to identify clean energy pathways for India to achieve our net zero targets by 2070, while ensuring that such pathways are inclusive, secure, and sustainable. So, it's a more of a multi-dimensional approach, which is very essential. His professional expertise spans areas such as multidimensional poverty, smart cities, digital agriculture, and climate change. Thanks, Venu, again for joining. Second, we have Falco. Thanks, Falco, for taking the time to join us. Falco is a senior scientist and deputy head of the Energy Transition Lab at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. He leads work on hydrogen, electrification, and industry transformation. So I think CCUS falls squarely within his domain. His research focuses on enabling the transition to climate neutrality with a particular emphasis on the role of low carbon hydrogen and e-fuels. He has contributed to 2 IPCC reports and advises policymakers and international bodies like the IEA and OECD ITF. Third, we have Rabab. Thanks, Rabab, for taking the time to join us. Rabab is an assistant manager for carbon capture at IATA, short for International Air Transport Association, where she leads work on carbon capture and removal strategies for aviation. Her work focuses on advanced CCS and CDR technologies that can help the sector reach net zero emissions. It also includes evaluating different removal technologies for air transport, which is what Air IAT is all about, analyzing policy frameworks, and supporting advocacy for the air transport sector. So welcome all three. We had a fourth panelist who unfortunately couldn't join us. If he does, I'll make a quick introduction and then move forward. So let's get into the panel discussion. Please do post your questions, if any, in the chat window, and if time permits, we'll take them towards the end. So Venu, I'll begin with you. The government always gets the first, say, and perhaps the last say as well. But I think many of us know that Niti Aayog is working on roadmaps for decarbonization, and I think it's been going on for a while. Clearly, it's a fairly complex exercise. In our assessment, CCUS almost is essential, or you cannot get away without CCUS in terms of net zero, although in the shorter term you're looking at energy efficiency and RE, and it's understandable. But from your perspective, how significant is CCUS? Or is the thinking that perhaps it's better to just transition into different technologies that do not require CCUS? So just to lay the groundwork, what are your initial thoughts on this?
No, thanks, Hemant, and thanks, Deepak, for that wonderful presentation. I think it does cover a lot of ground in terms of what I want to talk primarily. So just, I think, Hemant, just as you mentioned, I think briefly talking about what NITI has been doing since last year. We had these interministerial working groups that have been formed, and these working groups are primarily looking at various aspects of the transition, ranging from the macroeconomics of it, climate finance of it, or understanding the deep sectoral roadmaps. So now where we are at primarily is that most of the analysis work and most of the work is largely complete, and some of these work has been presented at multiple levels in multiple discussions, which CW also has been part of many of these discussions. Now where we are at is that we are hoping that some of this work over the course of next 2 months will get in the public domain. And in that sense, we'll be looking at a host of options primarily for India's mitigation journey. CCS is indispensable, as you said. We're not looking at the CCUS, both storage and the utilization are indispensable for India's low carbon solutions for us to become net zero. NITI's own assessment are no different from the assessments done by other teams or other organizations, IEA, CW itself, in terms of looking at close to 1.5 to 2 gigatons of emissions in 2070 probably has to be mitigated through carbon capture. So in a sense, most of the ballpark numbers put carbon capture emissions that needs to be mitigated by storage or utilization in the ballpark range of 1.5 to 2 gigaton. And these are predominantly coming in from the sectors that you spoke about: cement, steel, petrochemicals, refineries. And we start with that, these are very important sectors where it's very difficult to look at for other alternatives primarily. So in fact, for cement, the process emissions, there's no other solution other than carbon capture. And even looking at alternatives in terms of cement, some of the early stakeholder discussions hinted that strength is an important factor. So we're not able to mitigate large amount of emissions without CCS in cement sector. Similar such discussions across the petrochemical value chain, refinery value chain. So those streams that you pointed out, especially in terms of capture points from the end sector users, I think these sectors primarily completely will be indispensable for need of carbon capture and utilization, especially for them to be net zero. Now, in terms of how does this carbon capture from these various end users gets utilized, I think these are some of the wonderful analysis that you have done, pointed out. Some of them might be storage, some of them might be utilization, and probably we can come out in the second round of discussions. I don't want to preempt some of those answers. But to conclude, what I would say is that hopefully in a couple of months from now, NITI's work will be in the public domain, will have some strategic directions. And NITI is also working on, NITI has in fact published a report on carbon capture way back in 2022. And we are now working with some ministries to develop a roadmap approach for carbon capture. So that is something that is in progress, and hopefully over the coming months, that work also will take some big shape.
Great. Thanks, Venu. Indispensable is the word I was looking for. Thank you. Falco, for us, CCU is very attractive, right? Not the S part. CCS is a sunk cost year after year, and you get nothing in return. But CCU is attractive to us because India imports enormous amounts of energy. So from an energy security perspective, at least prima facie, it looks like a very attractive option because you utilize something that is unwanted, which is CO2, converted into some kind of fuel, and then reuse it, right? So that's the thinking at our end, but clearly the assessment, given the state of technology today and the cost, seems like it is probably not a short to medium term solution. But we have heard a lot about CCU coming out of Europe. So wanted your sense of where do things stand there? Are they, or are you guys doing things differently? Better than how we think we can do it? Is it more financially viable, or is it a lot of money being thrown around by the government which is making it possible? So what are your views? Are there any success stories in Europe? And if there are, how did they make those, projects financially viable or more, economically viable?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks for the introduction, Hemant. Thanks for the nice talk, Deepak. Yes, so in Europe, we basically agree on that CCU, so in the sense of CCU fuels and CCU feedstocks and CCU products in general, as well as CCS are requirements for the pathway towards climate neutrality. So we have strategies around those two pillars. And of course, you can also combine them by producing CCU fuels based on fossil CO2. With respect to CCU projects, we see actually a large competitiveness gap also in Europe with fossil fuels. And that is despite our main instrument, and that is the EU ETS CO2 pricing. But the prices that we currently see, they're around 70 euro per ton of CO2, are by far not enough to make CCU fuels competitive. But this is no surprise. It's an early technology, and also in Europe, and actually that's true globally. We see now the first project that are at substantial, at industrial scale. So you have to, globally, there are roughly about 30 bigger projects that have reached an FID, CCU-based projects. So we are really globally, we are just at an emerging market, or at the first step of creating a market, basically. Most of these projects, or the big projects, they are in China. They are mostly producing methanol. In general, most of the projects rather produce a liquid fuel and less so synthetic gas, less so SNG, because SNG is a bit less valuable. Also, it's very clear from scenario analysis that we need liquids that contain carbon also in the long term for a variety of sectors, like the chemical sector, like aviation, like the maritime sector. So it's very clear that we need those liquids. So there is a case long-term for CCU-based fuels, but still competitiveness gaps are there. And unfortunately, they likely remain so. So from our analysis, especially if you consider European electricity prices or anticipated hydrogen costs, there will be a competitiveness gap. So we are not as optimistic as your S2 scenario, I have to say. But that is okay because we have carbon prices and carbon prices will likely rise. In the short term, we do all kinds of policy support towards CCU-based projects. There are some regulations so that we have quotas, for instance, for eSAF, so sustainable aviation fuel based on e-fuels. So quotas that are very modest in the short term, 1.2% of aviation fuel needs to be eSAF by 2030. And it's not very sure whether we will achieve this actually. But then we also have policy support in terms of subsidies. So we have hydrogen auctions where billions are spent on projects, including CCU projects, but also including pure hydrogen or ammonia projects. And we have national policy instruments. So the auctions that I mentioned, they're EU auctions. Yeah, how to conclude? Maybe I say one thing with respect to using fossil CO2 for producing fuels. There are some projects that do this. They mainly focus on cement, as here CO2 emissions are really unavoidable. With respect to steel, Europe mainly pursues a different strategy, and that is changing from blast furnace BOF route to hydrogen DRI route. One reason being that you cannot capture all the emissions. So you have residual emissions, and the CO2 price works on those residual emissions, making CCS-based, coal-based CCS steel very expensive. So there's a different strategy, but it has some challenges as final investment decisions are difficult also with respect to DRI-based hydrogen steel.
Great. Thank you, Falco. I think the fact that you have, a robust carbon price probably, can bridge at least some of the premium, if not all of it, something that we don't have yet. But hopefully the, carbon credit trading scheme in India, CCTS in short, will hopefully, bridge some of it at our end. We have our fourth panelist actually trying to join by train. He's in a train right now. If he is able to join again and the connection is stable, then we'll bring him into the conversation. But Rabab, thanks for being patient. I think you guys get to have all the fun because you don't really have any options, or at least so it seems. So in the aviation sector, at least from our perspective, electrification is really really far away, given commercial scale airlines and the weight and the size. So is it also IATA's position that SAF is inevitable, and that's probably the only way to move forward from a decarbonization perspective?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the wonderful presentation earlier. To answer your question, I think that SAF, to say that SAF is really the only solution for the aviation sector is not exactly true, but IATA also has a sort of net zero roadmap to outline how the aviation sector can reach net zero. And of course, SAF contributes a big chunk of that decarbonization. So around, I believe, 65 or 63% of aviation emissions in 2050 is going to be reduced by SAF. So I think our net zero strategy for the air transport sector can be divided into 3 steps. It's reducing energy, replacing energy, and capturing the rest of the carbon. And SAF definitely falls into the second category, where you replace existing fossil-based fuel with sustainable aviation fuel made from renewable resources. But other than that, there is a sort of way to also reduce energy, and this can be done in the short term through replacing fleet, so replacing older aircraft with new generation aircraft and reducing the time by which you replace that aircraft. Maybe you use it for 10 years instead of 15, and that also reduces a lot of emissions. And this is something that a lot of airlines are already doing, and we expect this type of improvements in fleet and also in operation improvements, like improvements in air traffic management, to reduce about 10% or so emissions in 2050. But like you said, we also look at replacing energy, and SAF is, of course, a big part of that strategy, and also electrification. But as you said, that electrification is sort of still very far away. The cost of hydrogen, it's mentioned in the presentation, is still very significantly high, and there is a lot more research and testing required for hydrogen-powered aircraft before it can really be used for commercial aviation. And as for the current cost of SAF, it's of course very challenging. This was also mentioned in the presentation. The estimated cost of SAF currently is about 2 to 3 times higher than that of conventional fossil jets, sometimes even higher than that, depending on which SAF we're talking about. Like synthetic fuels is definitely higher than that even. And this is a deterring factor for, of course, the airline sector, because maybe it's not a very well-known fact, but the airline industry actually doesn't have very high profit margins. Our profit margins is a little over, I think, 3%. And so it's definitely the case that the high cost of SAF cannot be absorbed by just the industry alone. And this is why we really need some incentive, and this is where policy really plays a big role in order to bring more SAF into the market. So SAF is a nascent market. There are not a lot of volumes available currently. I think it stands at about 0.5 megatons. And we need like thousands of megatons by 2050 in order to reach our net zero goal. So it has to scale up significantly, and the cost will go down with the scale up and developing economics of scale. But to develop those economics of scale, we do need some other actors to absorb the cost of SAF. And that's why we really need policies to sort of incentivize SAF production and bringing more SAF into the market. And this will ensure that the cost of SAF doesn't necessarily fall specifically to the aviation sector, because the airline sector rather cannot really absorb the high cost of SAF currently. So we really need a policy intervention to get it down to a level where it becomes reasonable for the industry to bear the cost.
Yeah, but Prabha, very quickly, I mean, the one argument that is given against any kind of monetary support from the government is the aviation sector. The passengers are typically the highest strata of any society. And if they cannot bear the cost of, transition, then who can? So if you were to apply, a regulation which requires everyone to switch, would that kind of solve the, cost absorption problem?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, and we've seen different types of policies being deployed in different jurisdictions. For example, in the US, you have the tax credit for SAF, where you are provided a sort of credit for producers are provided a incentive credit for the production of SAF, and meanwhile, like in the EU, you have SAF mandates, so you have a specific volume that a supplier needs to supply to EU airports, as Falco mentioned earlier. So there are different ways where government intervention tries to bring these volumes to the market, but I think the core problem that these policies need to address is basically how to bring the cost down. And if these policies are not bringing the cost down, in the end, the industry can bear the cost, but it will mean that that the air transport sector might become a bit uncompetitive. It may hinder growth. it's a difficult question to answer whether how much of an impact SAF will have on air transport demand and passengers' ability to fly in the futures. And of course, air transport is really a big source of economic growth for a lot of countries, including India, which has one of the fastest growing in air transport industries in the world. So I think it's important to have the right balance between how much policy intervention can help bring the cost of SAF down and making sure that the industry also remains competitive and it's still a good source of economic growth for a lot of these countries.
Great, thanks, Rob. Clearly, I think we need a sector by sector evaluation on who can absorb what costs. Falco, if you're still there, one way to kind of mitigate the cost is through policy intervention, but perhaps another is to look at technology advancements. So, have you been tracking, the advancements on that front? Because some of the CCU, pathways that even we have evaluated looks at legacy technologies, whereas the newer ones perhaps are more efficient and, better at converting, feedstock into fuel. So one is, technology advancement. The second is, are there any other pathways that we can look at? Because we only have evaluated the synthetic pathways. So what is your view on how do we bring the costs down? Because I think that will be pivotal for CCU to be actually successful. Because some, countries, developing countries like India, we don't have the ability to bear the enormous, premium, which kind of plays out across all the sectors. I mean, it's not only one or two sectors, across the entire industrial sector. This is a problem that we are facing. So what are your thoughts on how do we reduce the cost?
Yes, so the most important thing is to actually realizing projects now. So there are hardly any projects. We have like around 30 bigger project FIDs. Some are close to being operational, but these are first of a kind projects. So it's no wonder that they are very expensive. So we need second generation and third generation projects. So we need several waves of project basically, such that the costs come down. And the costs, of course, are multifold. But maybe before I go into that, it has one clear policy implication, and that is create investments certainty, remove investment uncertainty. And this is with respect to regulation. So how is CO2 treated? What is sustainable CO2? What is sustainable hydrogen? And do not revise too much. Decide and follow through, because this regulatory uncertainty is one of the biggest drivers of that is holding back in investments. And then close supply chains. So realize offtake agreements basically. And yeah, one way of doing that is for the policymakers focusing on a sector and a case that is really competitive also in the long term, or like that is really needed in the long term. And I would say, for instance, since we were talking about aviation, like eSAF is such a sector, and then make it happen. And Germany and Europe has a combined approach there. So mandates on the one hand, then plus CO2 price. Aviation is part of the EU ETS, plus subsidies to close the competitiveness gap. And we have 1.2% of e-aviation fuel mandate in 2030. So that is a huge market for e-fuels, because we don't have e-fuels almost at all, but it's still a slight cost increase for the aviation industry that you can, of course, still dampen by putting subsidies on that. But really commit to this as a policymaker and make those projects happen. Right now, we do not see this mandate translate into investment decisions. So there's still uncertainty because there's a revision in the EU regulation, and the aviation industry doesn't like this mandate, and this is creating uncertainty and delay. So, and then where are costs where's potential for cost decline? Yeah, well, actually, all across the production chain. So electrolysis is still expensive. Electricity prices are often expensive. This depends on markets and regulation. But electrolysis, the electrolyzer plants alone, here we anticipate a lot of learning, and they turned out to be more expensive than expected 3 years ago. But then also the other main feedstock, CO2, the costs of CO2 are, of course, something that can go down. And here it depends on what kind of CO2 you have. I would argue that in the end, you need some very sustainable CO2, biogenic or atmospheric. And one key technology, for instance, is direct air capture. That is super expensive right now, but we still have to tap into it. It's not clear who's funding that. I would say those that are most responsible and for climate change and most developed, they should pay most of the learning curve around such technologies. But we have to do this. Otherwise, this can be a make or break for e-fuels in general. So direct air capture plants need to be subsidized, I would argue, to really bring down the cost at that end.
Got it. So Rabab, are you thinking about alternative pathways? Because at least as far as SAF is concerned, we have heard about biomass-based or waste-based pathways, which is not necessarily economical in other cases, but SAF is being talked about. So what's IATA's position there? Are you looking at alternative pathways for SAF?
Yeah, I think we're looking at all pathways because we recognize that we need every pathway in order to reach the volumes required to reach net zero CO2 emissions. I think Falco summed up the economics of e-fuels quite well. It has high capital costs, particularly the capital costs associated with green hydrogen is a major factor, and that would need to go down significantly. Green hydrogen is also a commodity in high demand in other decarbonizing sectors, especially hard-to-abate ones like steel, cement, and even if we're also talking about lowering the carbon intensity of fossil-based products, you also need a bit of green hydrogen for that. So it has a high demand in a lot of industrial sectors. But regardless, we did actually a finance roadmap for reaching net zero CO2 emissions that was released last year. And we estimated that the minimum selling price, so basically the price required for the product to break even, we estimated that for e-fuels to be about $6,200 US dollars per ton of SAF. And in comparison, the HEFA pathway, so the hydrotreated esters and fatty acids pathway, has about 1,200 minimum selling price USD per ton, which is quite significantly lower. And the alcohol to jet pathway is about 2,300, and the Fischer-Tropsch pathway, which uses a lot of waste and residues, agricultural residues, is about 4,800 USD per ton. So there's a big gap between the biogenic pathways using biogenic feedstocks and the synthetic fuels pathways. But in spite of the gap in cost, we do recognize that we need all pathways. There are, in the short to medium term, perhaps more focus will be placed on biofuel pathways. And of course, we see that in the EU as well, where the sub-mandate for PTL doesn't really come after, I think, 2030 or 2035. But regardless, we also need to recognize that biofuel pathways also has its limitations, and particularly we're talking about feedstock limitations. There's only so much biofuel feedstocks that we can procure, and feedstock cost is also a big factor. A lot of the cost of producing SAF comes from the cost of feedstock, and for e-fuels, the cost of feedstock is basically green hydrogen and the captured CO2. But while the cost is lower for bio-based pathways, it can go higher when we see the availability of such feedstock starts to dwindle as we produce more. And theoretically, for e-fuels, we can have an unlimited amount of feedstock. We can have an unlimited amount of captured CO2 and production of green hydrogen. So while the economics isn't really favorable at the moment, we do expect PTL or e-fuels to play a very big role in the aviation sector in the future, and this is also reflected in the International Civil Aviation Organization's long-term aspirational goal scenario, where as much as I believe 60% of SAF in 2050 is projected to be produced via e-fuel. So it's going to be very important. But regardless, I think IATA places emphasis on all pathways to produce SAF.
Thanks, Prabhav. Clearly, no easy answers there, because one quick point on biopathways is that it also results in soil degradation, and then you have to worry about using artificial chemical fertilizers then to bring it back to life. And so does green hydrogen in terms of land availability for solar and wind. So clearly, no easy answers there. Venu, if you're still there, it kind of begs the question, if you have to kind of play devil's advocate here, is, should we just seriously look at CCS simply because you don't have to deal with the green hydrogen problem, right? So the cost of carbon capture can come down. We know that there are multiple newer technologies that are coming our way. We do have significant resources in the country potentially. 300 gigatons is our estimate, and there are a few others as well. So what is your view on, should we focus at a country level? Of course, we need all the pathways, but does CCS play a more prominent role, and CCU only supports it? Any thoughts there?
So my sense is, I think there's a twofold approach. Primarily, I think this is what probably will emerge, as well as we have much more enhanced understanding on how the CCUS is going to come into force, or how a CCUS next mission probably shapes in place. So one is that while there is a theoretical potential of 200 to 300 or 300 to 400 gigatons, as you put it, much of that potential is theoretical. So there's going to be some time through which we actually have to realize that potential, right? So we have to do those seismic surveys. We have to probably put regulations in board. We have to understand if you can attract finances that can actually enable us to, make those CO2 to be stored, to be permanently attracting Article 6 money, or, Article 6 finance. So I think that's a long way process. So in the meanwhile, in the short run, given that there are sectors like, especially for the utilization, we could actually potentially look at sectors like enhanced oil recovery. We can look at, probably trapping the carbon captured in the cement primarily. So concretization of cement, carbonization in that sense. So there are sectors in the short term where we can actually potentially make a case, and probably also generate credits, and by the, raise money as well for our pilot projects, as a bet, in terms of understanding that the technology, especially for the utilization stage, in the shorter run. But in the longer run, I think we have to work on the storage, because we're looking at 1.5 to 2 gigatons to be actually be amenable to carbon capture, which can only be feasible through something like storage. Because as you said in the report that you've just published, that you're talking about 220 million tons as on today, but maybe let's say it will scale up by another, let's say, a factor of 4 or 5. But that still would leave a substantial amount of carbon, which has to be then stored in underground reservoirs, in underground basins. So in that sense, the approach, I think, should be dual-fold. In the short run, probably look at sectors where there can be an easy, viable, primarily case value proposition that can be built in, with some government support, of course, because given the cost dynamics, especially on the green hydrogen being very costly at this moment. Maybe if it's not green hydrogen, let's look at green hydrogen for the time being, as long we crack the pilots, we understand the technology, and then move towards completely clean solutions. So I think that's the approach that I think we should think about. Again, this is not the government thinking. This is as a person who is contributing towards some of these discussions.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very good framework to think about. Short to medium term is where you're looking at alternatives, applications for CO2 or CCU, and in the longer run, CCS for sure. I think it also ensures that all pathways are open, in terms of discovery and innovation and R&D. So that's a good way to look at it. But even in the short to medium term, Falco, the question that keeps coming up is, is something green or not, right? Especially when you're talking of CCU, already there is a huge debate that is going on green hydrogen itself, on various kinds of definitions, sources, whether your solar is or your renewable power is hard coupled to the plant or not. So there are a whole bunch of questions on what constitute greenness. So my question is, when you're talking of CCU, how does the EU define greenness in CCU? Because the CO2, does it have to come in from a biosource, or can fossil-based CO2 also be considered green when it's converted into a CCU fuel? So if you can shed some light there.
Yes, so we have something special in Europe, and this is called an RFNBO. And this is a renewable fuel of non-biological origin. And this is a product category, and this product category is subsidized and supported through various schemes. So in short, you want to be an RFNBO. And RFNBOs are supposed to be clean, so worthwhile to being supported. And e-fuels can be RFNBOs if they fulfill two conditions. So first, the source of CO2 has to be clean, and then a hydrogen has to fulfill some criteria. You were asking about CO2, and the easy way is biogenic and atmospheric. So for instance, direct air capture CO2 is obviously considered renewable and therefore clean. So everything that is non-fossil is fine. Fossil can also be fine, but there are two requirements. And in general, using fossil CO2 to produce then an RFNBO is only a transitional option. The first requirement is this CO2 needs to be CO2 priced, because the anticipation is that it's rather, when it's an RFNBO, it will eventually end up in the atmosphere. So somebody has to pay the price. It can be the CO2 source or can be the utilization. They can agree on something, but it needs to be CO2 priced, and then it can be an RFNBO. However, there is a deadline to that, and that is for fossil CO2 sources from industry like steel or cement. It's 2040. After this, you can still use the CO2, but you cannot call it RFNBO anymore with all the privileges associated with that. And for the power sector, you can also use CO2 from a coal or gas power plant, but there the deadline is 2035. So this is a brief sketch of CO2. Yeah.
So essentially what you're saying is that whoever is financing the project has to look at a recovery period, capex recovery period of 10 or 15 years, depending on the sector. Is that a fair point?
Yes, and this is the window for fossil CO2 in Europe is quite narrow, because you're not an RFNBO. I mean, you can still produce from fossil CO2, but you simply lose the status of being an RFNBO, and you potentially lose some subsidies in 2035 or 2040. So you have to recover your investment costs before that. And this argument is used by some industrial actors to saying, no, the EU ETS is strong enough, we don't need this deadline. But actually, the deadline is something like a safety net, because actually, it's true, if you only rely on the EU ETS pricing, the prices in 2040 should be really, really, really high, because actually there are no new certificates in the EU ETS given out, because the EU ETS sectors should be net zero already in Europe, because they are the potentially easier to abate sectors. So yes, it's there is a brief window also, and there's some I can also say lobbying towards actually softening those rules for Europe. I say one last thing: in these requirements, they are in line with the EU's climate targets. EU wants to be climate neutral in 2050. and then the EU ETS sectors, they are more easy to abate than buildings and mobility. So there are good reasons for putting deadlines for the use of fossil CO2.
Got it. Thanks. So that leads me to a question for Bob. We were hoping that we could sell some of our high premium SAF to, either European or developed country, aviation companies, but seems like definitionally is going to be at odds. So, how is IATA looking at this, and, what is it that you're doing to try and facilitate potentially international travel, because I think that's where the premium can potentially be absorbed the most, given the type of flyers. I mean, you're not going to go by a ship because airline tickets are slightly more expensive. So clearly the easiest one to target. But given these definitional challenges, how do you see the future shaping up?
Yeah, thank you. I think going back to what I said earlier, the most important thing right now is to get the cost curve for SAF down. I think we all need to remember that in end of the day, SAF is a market, and a market will respond to demand and supplies. And at the moment, the demand isn't really for SAF, but rather for jet fuel. And SAF is just, if you take out the environmental attribute, it is essentially a more sustainable type of jet fuel. So in the absence of mandate, perhaps there will not be a lot of voluntary demand for SAF, and that's a big problem when we're talking about offtake agreements. So earlier Falco mentioned that we need financing for projects. We need to get projects off the ground, and this cannot happen without demand for the product, because without demand there will not be people who are doing the supply. And so offtake agreements are really important, and our member airlines have done a lot of offtake agreements already. And our role as IATA, as an industry association, is to do more capacity building and engagement with different stakeholders involved in decision-making processes for building SAF plants and supporting the industry, like producers of SAF, suppliers of SAF, and policymakers. So offtake agreements are usually at this point voluntary, and they're really important because their offtake agreements basically show that there is a demand for SAF, and this essentially helps to de-risk the market. So the one thing that it does is that it makes it ensures whoever is financing the project, be it like banks who are giving out loans, or investors investing in a project, to make sure that there's a demand for the project. And for an airline, it's important that when they're doing offtake agreements, they're assured that they are going to be delivered that volume of SAF that they agreed to purchase at the time when the offtake agreement is supposed to be fulfilled. So as IATA, we try to engage a lot of policymakers and airlines and different stakeholders in the supply chain, essentially, to make sure to sort of create a dialogue on what is really needed to scale the market. So we, of course, governments play a big role in sort of getting some early stage projects off the ground, to build demo plans, to build pilot plans, to have a proof of concept for newer pathways, perhaps. And of course, we need to engage both airlines and policymakers in the current implementation of policies like the EU mandate, which started this year. There are, from observation, a lot of operational challenges in implementing these policies. And so we help both airlines to navigate through these policies, as well as to engage the policymakers involved to offer improvements for the benefit for both the airline sector and for the scale up of the SAF industry.
Got it. Thank you. I hope other sectors probably can take the same initiative that you folks have taken, just so that we can push CCU a little bit. I think it'll be a long way before all of this becomes viable, but all the actions in the interim are probably very essential. So I think with that, we'll close the panel discussion. I wanted to give Venu the last word, but seems like he had to step out. But he has laid the framework out as far as how the government is potentially thinking about it, with CCU being a short to medium term solution, with some amount of CCS coming in the medium term, but longer term, I think substantially more CCS, just given the scale of CO2 that needs to be mitigated. We do have a few questions that I'll kind of read out. Happy for Falco, you or Rabak to take it. Alternatively, my colleague Deepak can also answer. The first question is from Rajat Dhaka. He's asking, can green methanol be produced using CO2 captured from industrial sources like coal-based power or cement plants? If green hydrogen is used, will it still qualify as green methanol in India? So I guess we know the answer in EU, but I think in India we don't yet have a definition for CCU and whether something is green or not green, Rajat. So at this point, the jury is still out, and we don't know if the government will come out with a definition, and if so, what that definition will look like. But clearly, in the EU, there's a short time frame depending on which sector you're drawing the CO2 from, and that will decide whether your CCU fuel, e-fuel, is green or not. Rajat has a second question as well. Is CO2 sequestration, that is underground storage, allowed in India? And if so, what are the benefits or incentives for doing it? I can answer that. And I would urge you to also look at one of our publications from a couple of years ago, where we have done an assessment of storage resources in India, which is where the earlier 300 gigatons number came from. In India, as of now, there are no active pure CCS or EOR projects, on the ground. There is one EOR project which is not a pure CCS; it's for enhanced oil recovery. For those of you who don't understand it, essentially you inject CO2 to extract more crude oil from the ground. One of them is being planned in the state of Gujarat, but it has not materialized yet. So as of now, there is nothing on the ground. I think there is one more question from Ajay Karajikar. What is the energy required to dissociate a CO2 molecule for production of e-fuels? Would it be better to use CO2 for EOR, EGR, and keep to hydrogen ammonia for renewable fuels? What happens to existing refinery petrochemical infrastructure to avoid legacy assets? I'll take the second half on what happens to legacy capacity. We are doing some modeling, and in fact, we're launching a report next month on transportation fuels. This is ground transportation. I mean, do attend the session to understand more, but our view is that the refinery petrochemical transition is a multi-lever approach, from refinery to more petrochemical, and then shutting some of the refinery units down to use of LNG, etc. So that is a longer term transition that will happen in a very sequential manner, if at all. On the question on CO2 molecule, I guess Deepak can take it, and then Falco, you had your hand up as well. Deepak?
Yeah, so in terms of energy required for splitting of CO2 molecule, the energy requirement essentially depends on the kind of reaction that you are driving, right? So if it is ethanol production, then you need a different hydrogen consumption per ton of ethanol. Whereas if you're talking about production of olefin, then your hydrogen consumption value changes. So those numbers are there in the report, which is now available on our website, Ajay, right? So you can go through the website, and it's basically pure, chemical equation balancing that will give you an estimate on the amount of energy which is required to dissociate the CO2 molecule.
Yes, Falco, I think you had your hand up. Please do respond.
Yes, I want to say two things. I agree with Deepak with what he just said. And the reason for that is, so typically when you have CO2, it's not very reactive. You have to activate it. So you need one molecule of H2 to actually activate it to CO, which is carbon monoxide. That is then often the feedstock that is actually used in a methanol synthesis or in a Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. So you're losing one H2 already, and then it depends on the product how much H2 you need for the product. But this can be 1/3 already, and Therefore, it's actually crucial to develop synthesis that run on CO2 directly. They can then save some energy there. And with respect to the conclusion of this, it's true what is mentioned in the comment, and that is if you have an application that requires carbon, you probably don't want to run it on carbon. So anything that only requires ammonia or hydrogen, it's quite an effort to add the carbon to it. The carbon also has advantages, obviously. Like ammonia is toxic, and handling hydrogen is more challenging. But it's a trade-off, and I tend to say carbon where carbon is needed, and those sectors that need carbon, they are huge already.
Okay. There's one more question. I'm not sure I fully understand, but this is from Janak Raj. What is the time frame considered for the reduction in CCU to play? I presume it means, how much time will it take for us to achieve $1 per kg green hydrogen? It's anyone's guess. If you ask, one of the largest refining company in India today, they'll say by 2030, but we think it's more post 2035 or 2040 is when we could potentially achieve the $1 per kg, largely because it relies on really cheap renewable power. And that I think requires innovation on the photovoltaic end, which is happening, but I think it's at least a decade away, if not more. I think that's it as far as questions are concerned, and we are already a minute over, but I want to thank everyone who attended the workshop today. I hope you have found value. Do take a look at our publication, and a big thank you to Falco and Rabab and Venu earlier for taking the time to talk to us. Clearly, the show is just beginning. There's a lot more to go. Of course, one of the pathways to decarbonization, but we have to explore everything out there because time is, ticking away. So thank you, everyone. Do take a look at our publication, and if you have any questions, feel free to email us, those questions. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.